Good evening, Kate Borsay with you here on Times Radio. Now, one subject we like to return to fairly regularly on the programme is long COVID. As many as 2 million people in the UK may have had long COVID since the pandemic began, experiencing a range of symptoms from fatigue to muscle pain to coughs and headaches for a prolonged period of time. And sometimes the symptoms can get much worse as well. Well, now parallels are being drawn with ME, also known as chronic fatigue syndrome, as well as other post-viral and autoimmune conditions. Scientists and patients are hoping that studies into long COVID will lead to a long overdue deeper understanding of ME. About 250,000 people in the UK suffer from ME, which can be debilitating, but patients still often face doubts about the reality of their symptoms, and treatment options are subject to controversy. Well, tonight we welcome back Dr. David Strain, Senior Clinical Lecturer at the University of Exeter Medical School. He also leads the British Medical Association's response to long COVID. Good evening to you, Dr. David Strain.
Good evening.
Hello. We're also joined by Sonya Chowdrey, CEO of Action for ME. Good evening to you, Sonya.
Good evening.
And we're also joined by Dr. Asad Khan, a respiratory consultant based in Manchester. He suffers from long COVID and has also developed ME. Good evening to you, Asad. Oh, I think we're waiting for Dr. Asad to join us, so we'll hang on a little bit there. We're also later on going to be speaking to Claire Hasty, a regular contributor to the programme on long COVID. She's the founder of the Long COVID Support Group, and we'll be consulting her on some of what we've learned a little later on, and then checking in with Monique Jackson as well, who is living with long COVID. Now, Dr. Asad Khan is with us, but you're on mute, Dr. Asad Khan. So
I'm unmuted now. Hello. Thank you very much for the invitation.
Thank you for joining me. So, Dr. David Strain, if we can start with you first of all. You took part, along with Sonya, in a really interesting platform discussion as part of the Times, talking about long COVID and the relationship to ME. Just take us through some of the basics for people who maybe haven't sort of heard about this association before.
Yeah, so the key features that we keep hearing about for long COVID are debilitating fatigue, difficulty concentrating, or we call it brain fog, and then a post-exertional malaise. That is that you'll do something active, but then for hours, weeks, hours, or even days afterwards, it will take you to recover. And when I say do something active, it's not necessarily physical activity. It can be focusing just on watching a TV show or a children's performance. That can be enough to exhaust you physically and leave you with pains and aches throughout your body. Now, they are things that we've heard about for long COVID, but actually they are also the hallmarks of myalgic encephalomyelitis. Chronic fatigue syndrome, as it's almost disparagingly called, because it's that post-exertional malaise that sets it apart, this disproportionate pain and fatigue after any sort of activity. We think that ME and CFS are post-viral syndromes. And from everything that we're seeing in clinical practice, that the only difference between ME and CFS and long COVID is that we know the virus that is the trigger to long COVID, as opposed to ME and CFS could be a whole host of other different viruses, but all triggering the same sorts of phenomena.
Really interesting. Sonya Chowdrey. Forgive me for mispronouncing that. Tell me about how many people we know suffer from ME. As CEO of Action for ME, let's get genned up on this. How many people in the UK suffer from ME?
We think there's at least 250,000 people with ME. That's children and adults. So 1 in 250 people experiencing this really disabling, debilitating disease. 1 in 4 people are so severely affected that they're house and often bedbound, not just for days or weeks, but often months, years, and even decades. Some of those individuals are so severely affected, they're in darkened rooms because they've got hypersensitivity to light. Some people are unable to be touched because they're hypersensitive to touch, maybe hypersensitive to noise, and often people are severely isolated.
That's really interesting. And when did you start to first hear about perhaps a correlation, parallels between long COVID and ME, Sonya?
Well, we were sadly predicting that there may be a correlation because the majority of people that get ME, not all, have a viral trigger that they can often identify. And so when the pandemic broke out, we were concerned that we would see exactly as we are now, the number of people with ME-like symptoms either being diagnosed or have suspected ME. I think, with ME in terms of the diagnosis, the 2007 NICE guideline, adults have to be ill for a period of time. So within sort of 4, 6 months, 8 months after after somebody's had COVID and then not recovering and being diagnosed with long COVID, we're starting to ask the question, are the symptoms that have parallels with ME? And we are indeed now seeing as a charity a number of people being diagnosed with ME or have suspected ME.
And these are people who have long COVID. So it's possible to have long COVID. In fact, Dr. Asad Khan, you should probably come in to this discussion at this point, because it's possible to have long COVID and to have ME as well. Dr. Asad Khan.
Yes. So, I'm here. Yes. So, I guess, yes, SARS-CoV-2 is a virus, and the majority of patients with long COVID do experience PEM, which is one of the hallmarks of ME. In fact, it is the hallmark diagnostic criteria for ME, whichever international or Canadian consensus criteria you use. But there is a group of people with long COVID who do not have that feature and will not go on to develop ME. So there are people who may just have damage to an organ, such as the heart, and they don't have the fatigue and post-exertion malaise that the sort of more ME type people will have. So I think with any kind of new virus, one has to remain quite cautious. One has to remain clinically curious. What sorts of things is this giving rise to? Certainly in my case, I started with organ damage. I started with urticaria, which was uncontrollable. The fatigue and the post-exertional malaise actually came much later. They came in month 3 after the urticaria had gone away. But now they are the predominant feature, along with, in my case, postural tachycardia syndrome, which is a disorder of the autonomic nervous system, which is common to both ME and
we've got a slight
long
issue.
COVID. So I think there appear to be two polarizing views. One, in different conditions, there's no... Hello?
Hello.
Yes. So there appear to be quite polarizing views where there is one group which says they are completely different. Now, I think that's wrong, because if we say they are completely different, then we risk not learning the lessons from the past, and we risk going down the wrong lines of research. But if we say they're exactly the same, then we risk missing out on the other manifestations that may arise from long COVID, apart from the ME. Having said that, the ME community has been really underserved when it comes to investigation of organ damage due to the viruses that are known to cause ME. So I'm sure there's a lot more organ damage and ME than we actually are aware of, if that makes sense.
Yeah, okay. Dr. David Strain, do you want to come in on that and just sort of help us elaborate further? Dr. Asad Khan was, talking about people, perhaps thinking that they are completely different, ME and long COVID, another group perhaps saying that they're exactly the same, but really we're talking about kind of a space that sort of occupies both those chain of thoughts, really.
Yeah. So long COVID is a collection of different presentations, and we do see a huge variety. So we see people presenting more with chest pain or with palpitations, with cardiac inflammation. They can present with the POTS syndrome, this postural orthostatic tachycardia. Basically, you stand up and your body doesn't regulate itself properly. And these can all be manifestations of long COVID, and they are by no means the most common, but they are all manifestations. And people with those sorts of syndromes want to actually distance themselves from ME. And I think a big part of this is because of the stigma that's hung around ME for decades. ME, or chronic fatigue syndrome, I have to admit, when I was training in medical school, it was known as yuppie flu. It was known as a functional condition, that there is nothing physically wrong with these people. They just need jolly good talking to, and they can all get up and get about life. And as we've done more research into it, we're seeing significant physical differences in these people with ME and CFS. But the stigma is still there. There are still some doctors of my generation and before that were taught that this is not a real medical condition. And there needs to be a massive re-education there in order to accept that this is a very physical condition. People are suffering with this on a daily basis. And actually, the research that's happening today in long COVID, as we start to find the autoimmune, as we start to see things like the vaccines are having a beneficial impact on people with both long COVID, and for a proportion of people with ME and CFS that are actually seeing a similar sorts of response, that lends to see that these two diseases are similar. Now, that doesn't mean they're the same. There are very likely to be some fundamental differences, but we need to focus on what the similarities are, what the differences are, in the hopes that, firstly, long COVID can start running, because it can learn the research that's gone before in ME and CFS, albeit, as Dr. Khan says, nowhere near as much as the condition deserves. There has been some research that's a good start, but it also means that people who are living with CFS and ME can hopefully gain from the extensive research program that's around today looking at long COVID.
Dr. Sonya Chowdrey, you will have seen, presumably, perhaps a bit more sympathy, perhaps a bit more understanding from people about ME because of the reaction, because of the understanding that we have of long COVID, have you?
Yes, that's correct. For some people, that's definitely the case. And I think we have a large number of people that are affected with long COVID all at the same time. We know what the viral trigger was, and the press coverage, the media coverage has really shone a light on the experiences of people with long COVID. And as the parallels have been drawn with myalgic encephalomyelitis, that has given us an opportunity to raise understanding about the experience that people have had for years, for decades. And that's just gone hidden and neglected over that period of time. So I definitely think there is an increased understanding. However, we are hearing from people with long COVID and ME-like symptoms that they are experiencing stigma, they're experiencing neglect, they're being told to get back to work when they're too ill, their doctor is not believing that they have something that's wrong with them. And what we absolutely have to do is to ensure that both people with ME and those with long COVID, whether it's the same thing, a different thing, they have one or they have both, everybody needs to have the understanding and be treated with respect and be listened to, because people are suffering in extreme proportions and not acceptable.
And in terms of the number of cases of ME, has that gone up with, more people suffering from long COVID as a post-viral syndrome? Are you getting a lot more reported cases of ME as well?
We're certainly seeing that, and I'm speaking to people that are being diagnosed with ME now following COVID, long COVID. However, we know that the NHS is not recording the numbers of people with ME, and therefore it makes it very difficult for us to have an actual evidence base of the numbers in terms of people that have ME and have a diagnosis. We also know that there's a lot of misdiagnosis out there and people are going undiagnosed. So you put all of those things together and it makes it very difficult to come up with an actual number.
Yeah.
Sorry, go on.
Go on.
I was just going to say that we do know, for example, the UK Biobank, which has over 500,000 people that have given data and information, etc. Looking at those figures, we can extrapolate up, and this was a couple of years ago, the number of people that had said they had diagnosed ME within that. We were looking at around 286,000 people. at that point. So we expect that to be an underestimate, and we expect that figure to have gone up significantly.
Forgive this quite basic question, Sonya, but do you have to be sicker to get a diagnosis of ME than you would of long COVID? Because long COVID can just mean that you suffer from some fatigue after a period of time after contracting COVID. So it may be, a period of 4 weeks, it may be 6 weeks, it may be 12 weeks, 3 months. And if you suffer any kind of fatigue, anything different to you pre-COVID, you can class that as long COVID. But in order to be diagnosed with ME, do you have to hit a much kind of higher benchmark of how sick you are?
Certainly, the guideline which is used by doctors stipulates a period of time, and the guideline is under review at the moment. In the previous guideline for adults, it was 4 months, 3 months for children. So there are some ways of diagnosing that are different. And clearly with ME, we don't know what the viral trigger may have been. And for some, there may not have been a viral trigger in the way that we do know with long COVID. I think what is most important is that we have doctors that understand the symptoms, that understand what the patient is telling them, that they listen, they're curious, and they make a positive diagnosis based on the presentation of symptoms that individual is sharing with them. And if we achieve that, then actually we ensure that people get the diagnosis that they need. And then when their symptoms change and fluctuate, they can have those conversations with their doctor and make sure that they get the support that they're entitled to.
A quick reminder that we will be talking about latest research and developments with long COVID. We'll be speaking about that more after 11:30. I do want to stick with the parallels between ME and long COVID. Dr. Asad Khan, just bringing you back into this. Describe to me how you are mentally, because you've had long COVID. Well, first of all, you've had COVID. Now you've got long COVID. Yes. You've also developed ME as well. How's your mental health? I mean, that's an incredibly tough ride that you've been on.
Thank you for acknowledging that. And I think that is a part that is often missed in this discussion. Yes, this is a completely biomedical illness. However, there are huge psychological manifestations of it due to the extreme distress of the condition. So I can tell you now that at the beginning, when I started with my urticaria that did not respond to any antihistamines or steroids, I remember going out in the snow and lying there just to cool down and wishing for my life to end because it was so distressing. And then when that ended, and I started with the POTS and the crippling fatigue and the post-exertion days, where I can barely sit up for more than 5-10 minutes at a time. If I do any more than that, I get nauseous, I get lightheaded. I have some days, sometimes weeks, when I cannot tolerate any light or any sound. Even the sound of the leaves rustling outside can be intolerable. It can actually cause physical pain in the hands and feet. And I haven't worked for 10 months. I used to be a frontline respiratory consultant. I worked through the first and through the second half of the second wave on the COVID frontline. And I got this from work due to inadequate PPE. Also a family man, wife and 2 children, primary school aged. And, gym 3 times a week, very active social life, traveling all over the world, lived and worked in New Zealand, Lancashire, Greater Manchester. To have then found your life so limited, and also the lack of understanding from some people, because it's an invisible illness, and because on the outside you might just look a bit tired and miserable, and that doesn't necessarily reflect what's going on inside. people get fed up of you. And you do get comments like, well, maybe you are over-perceiving your symptoms. Maybe you just need to get back to work. Maybe you are getting deconditioned because of not working and because of not going out. Nobody wants to get back to work more than I do. I have not chosen to lie in bed like this. And I bet you if I had a cancer, even if it was a completely curable cancer, the attitudes of some of my family, friends and colleagues would have been totally different.
I'm so sorry to hear that you are really struggling with this. And also to hear, I mean, you're a doctor, you're a respiratory consultant. If there's anyone who's going to know how they feel and whether it's valid or not, it is you. And yet you're still being questioned and people are still making insensitive comments.
It's not unusual, actually. I'm part of a community of 1,200 doctors with long COVID, and the majority have had similar experiences. And I think, as David alluded to, it's to do with the way we're taught medicine, where if you have a disease that has multiple symptoms and some baseline tests are negative, there is an immediate leap to the conclusion that it is psychological. And that is a very reductionist and lazy way of practicing medicine. And you can be very sick without abnormal tests. And that could be because the tests haven't been invented yet, or you haven't looked hard enough. It is so important, as Sonya said, to acknowledge suffering and to believe your patient, to be humble, and to reassure them that, if nothing else, you as their doctor will support them and give them symptomatic relief, and make sure that they are cared for and not abandoned, as unfortunately has happened to ME patients over the decades and is now increasingly happening to patients with long COVID, including doctors like me. So I'm not alone in this.
Yeah, I mean, I know you speak for many people and we've heard lots of stories on this show, but we need reminding and people in power need reminding. Researchers sometimes need reminding, medical advances. We all need reminding about how important this is. And I'm glad that something like ME gets focused too, because hopefully as we look for answers with long COVID, we'll also find answers connected to ME as well. So thank you for sharing your experience with us. That was Dr. Asad Khan. Thank you. A respiratory consultant based in Manchester. And Dr. Khan has long COVID and has also developed ME. I'm just going to bring on briefly, we are going to pick up after the news, but just bring on briefly Claire Hasty, who's founder of the Long COVID support group. We'll be speaking to you more after the news, Claire, but I wondered if you would just offer us some comment there after hearing Dr. Asad's story.
Hi, good evening. It's a heartbreaking story, and unfortunately, as he says, it's not unique. The stories that we read about, both inside our Facebook group, which is 44,000 members now, and outside of that on Twitter and wherever, are similar. Some people have been having to sell their homes because they're unable to work. They've been treated terribly by friends, family, and their employers who don't understand. They have medical professionals who largely now are starting to be more sympathetic, but some of the disbelief has abated but still persists, because even though the medical professional might believe that long COVID is a phenomenon, they may not believe that that particular person's symptoms align with that. So there are so many barriers to overcome. And if you're in some sort of marginalized community, if you're, especially if you're children, for example, elderly people from different ethnic and socioeconomic backgrounds who are maybe, and people who are less assertive. We're seeing in our ongoing survey of people accessing help at long COVID services that it's actually those with the loudest voices who seem to be getting help. So my heart goes out to those who are really not being heard and not being seen.
Yeah. Claire Hasty there. We'll talk to you more, Claire, in about 5 minutes or so. Just a last word for you when we talk about the parallels between long COVID and ME, Sonya Chowdrey. Is there anything else we need to consider when we're talking about research and also commonalities, things to consider when we talk about the relationship between long COVID and ME? Anything else to add in?
Just to reiterate the point that actually we're seeing money rightly going into studying long COVID, and there's money going into research. We need to ensure that we leverage that so that we get better understanding for other post-viral illnesses like ME. It would not cost a huge amount of money to be able to do that. This is the greatest scientific opportunity that we have to better understand ME. And every single person suffering with ME, their families, people with long COVID, people with other post-viral illnesses deserve better. And the government has to step up and redress the paucity of research that we've got into those other illnesses.
Thank you very much, Sonya Chowdrey, CEO of Action for ME, as we look at the parallels between long COVID and ME. My thanks to Dr. Asad Khan as well, and all our best in your long recovery, Dr. Asad Khan. We'll come back after the news. We're going to check in with Claire Hasty again. We'll also speak to Monique Jackson, who's been a regular contributor on the show. She contracted COVID in the first wave, and she's been living with long COVID for an awful long time now. So we'll find out how things are going for her. And we'll bring back Dr. David Strain as well, as we look at what research, what developments we've learnt from the last month or two in terms of the quest to gain more understanding of long COVID. This is Kate Borsay on Times Radio. More on long COVID after the news with Owen Smith. We are at the moment doing a deep dive into long COVID. We've been looking at developments with the relationship between ME and long COVID, and now want to catch up with a couple of our regular guests to check in. The first is Monique Jackson, and Monique contracted COVID-19 back in March and has been suffering from long COVID for, well, an incredibly long time now. Evening to you, Monique. How are you doing?
Good evening, Kate. I'm okay, thanks. Feeling some improvement in some of my symptoms, thankfully, but still have some issues.
Tell us about whether you're able to work and what kind of issues you've got going on. How much is this playing a major part in your life still?
Well, I have. I was very athletic before, and for a long period of time, I was sort of in bed and not moving around much. Fortunately, I have been able to do a lot more moving around, and I am able to sort of do some freelance sort of projects and things, getting back into the swing of having a flexible working schedule. But relapses with fatigue and some other sort of issues do mean that I'm not yet quite ready to get back to the same pace I was before.
Has the support for you got any better, Monique, from your doctor? I mean, I know you've been taking part in some research as well, but has the support you've received got any better?
I haven't successfully managed to get through to a long COVID clinic. I've had more than 3 attempts for a referral from GP. So it's been a bit disappointing because I've had to I've had to speak to my GP to try and get one-off sort of issues. But I am pleased to be involved with Long COVID Support, which is the independent organisation helping people in my position. But I would love to see more support out there.
Yeah, and you've been working with the National Institute of Health Research. Just tell us what you've been doing with them.
So this year, I was in a privileged position to be a public panel member, and I helped with the process of funding research for non-hospitalised individuals with long COVID, looking into that area. And it gave me great insight into the potential for research to help get a better understanding of this illness, which presents in so many different ways and affects people of all different backgrounds and ages, and hopefully can effectively develop treatments in the future so that people don't have to suffer in ways from home like a lot of people are at the moment.
Have you found anything particularly works for you, Monique, in your sort of journey to recover?
I think it's been really important, particularly during isolation, where I haven't been able to work and or physically be in touch with people as I did before. to have a network of people, like being involved with patient groups, is quite important. I think having a creative outlet, as I do this Still Ill Corona Diary on Instagram, has been a great way to express and document what I've been going through. And having like medical professionals that believe you and have been there to give me key bits of medication through my recovery.
Are there any sort of particular, whilst we're talking about extra bits of information that we're gaining as the months go by, is there any particular medication which seems to be working? Are there any developments that you think are significant?
I think that I've got to be careful with what I say with this. I think that what's clear is that long COVID presents in so many different ways, and that it's really key that anyone who has concerns with that they think they've had COVID, and after a series of weeks their symptoms are not going away, that they get in touch with their GP and their doctors, and that they document on a Google Doc sheet what they're going through. And even though it might not be easy to get that pathway of care, to just keep pursuing. I am not going to advocate for a single bit of medication, because I think that it really, is down to doctors having to sort of assess people on a case-by-case basis.
Yeah. And that illustrates the complexity of long COVID as well, doesn't it, Monique? We've talked tonight about parallels with ME, but there's no specific symptom for either of those. You get a catalogue of different illnesses, all post-viral illnesses as a result of having COVID, or in the case of ME, of course, you may have had another viral infection. So you're right to kind of point out that complexity. Quick shout out, by the way, for Monique's Instagram, which is brilliant, and I love seeing her images. I've also loved seeing your following go up as well, Monique, which has been great. It's _Corona Diary if you want to look Monique up on Instagram and look at some of her fabulous artwork. It's great.
Thanks, Kate.
No, my pleasure. Monique, tell me about going forward then, as you try and navigate your way through this. What are your main thoughts, your main concerns, perhaps, about where you go from here?
I think that, as you pointed out, it's important that it is recognised this is a multi-system illness, and that there really is more visibility. As tonight we're talking about it, which is fantastic, and that there are other chronic illnesses such as ME and CFS who have overlapping similar symptoms, but there really is this gap in research that I think chronic illness in general needs to be re-examined, about how people who are non-hospitalised can manage their symptoms and be supported. And obviously, I'm in solidarity with all NHS workers right now who are trying their best and must be absolutely exhausted. And I think that I just hope that there's more continued investment and priority put towards medical staff and treatment of people at home. And we've got to really kind of look beyond the binary that COVID-19 is something that you either die or get back to 100%. A lot of people, unfortunately, are extremely debilitated right now. So I want to continue seeing that as a priority for investment and public policy.
Thank you, Monique. I'm going to bring back Claire Hasty on this. Claire, Monique's part of your long COVID support group, I know. So, a big shout to you and to everyone who you work with on the long COVID support group for what you offer. How big is the group now? And tell me about anything significant. I'll always bow to your wisdom. Anything significant you think we need to know about research developments into long COVID that's happened within the last couple of months?
Very kind of you to bow to my wisdom. I wish more people would bow to patients' wisdom. That's actually a theme that's come out of this. And I think it was touched upon earlier with David and Sonya as well. For people who have other conditions which are poorly understood, multi-systemic, and can show up in different ways, is that the importance of listening to patients, both at an individual level, if you're sitting either face-to-face or on a call with them, if they're telling you that there's something seriously wrong, believe them. I think Asad mentioned that the tests don't always show anything, but absence of evidence doesn't mean evidence of absence. And so that I really, so listening to people at an individual level, but also collectively. So that's where our group is now 44,000 members strong, and every time I pick up my phone or go to my laptop, there's a queue of people looking to join, because we have quite strict criteria for joining. We span 100 countries, so yes, we're growing all the time, which is, it's good in a way that people are finding us, but it's also really awful that so many people need help. And we're clearly only touching a fraction of the between 1 or 2 million that the ONS and the REACT-2 study have shown may have this condition. So in terms of learnings, it's great that some research projects are kicking off. Of course, research takes time. It's great that people around the world, some of the biggest brains around the world, are directing their efforts to understanding this. And I really hope, as Sonya and others said earlier, that learnings that do emerge from long COVID will have a bearing and help other conditions, be that ME, but there are also actually overlaps with other conditions, whether that's post-sepsis syndrome or multiple sclerosis or autoimmune conditions such as lupus, conditions like fibromyalgia. There are even, with menopause as well, there are so many, I suppose because long COVID affects everywhere in the body, there are overlaps with all sorts of conditions. So I don't think we should make any prejudgments, but I really hope that research into any of those can help the other conditions.
Well, thank you for joining us. Just to check in with you, how are you doing personally, Claire?
Myself and my 12-year-old twin sons, we're still living with it. Personally, it feels like my symptoms overall have dialed down a notch in the last 3-4 months. They're still there. They still flare up. So right now my chest and my heart are really hurting, and I've been sort of struggling to breathe or walk in the last couple of days. So much better, but still far from pre-COVID. I'm able to work, but I can only work 3 days a week. And I can't do the role I did before because I just can't really concentrate enough. I really struggle with that.
I know.
Thank you for asking.
Well, pleasure. Just very quickly, actually, one I should wing to you, Claire. I know we've spoken before about benefits for people who are long-term sick with long COVID, and I gather now, although it might be useful to get some insight from you on it, that the DWP are now able to give benefits to people with long COVID through the PIP, the personal independence payment.
Yeah, and we're seeing in our group that some people are successfully receiving that, although it's a battle for those who do. I'm not aware of anyone who's had it without having to go through an appeal process. And I know from my own experience of filling in the forms, I couldn't do it myself. It was far too exhausting, and I couldn't cognitively cope with it either. So I was very grateful to have friends who helped me. And my GP was supportive in writing a letter. But so many people are being turned down, and some are being successful at the second stage. It would be great for people not to have to jump through those hoops, and for long COVID to be recognised as a disability, so that employers understand the situation more. We're trying our best. We have a fantastic dedicated subgroup within our team who focus on return to work and employment issues, who are doing great advocacy work to try to co-develop materials with the likes of the Society of Occupational Medicine and other bodies. So we're a bunch of ill volunteers who are working really hard to try to raise awareness and get help for people.
Claire, you do, a lot of work to raise awareness within the media, and I want to just extend my personal thanks to you as well, because I know that you won't give up, and you are 44,000 strong now. And the first time I spoke to you, I'm trying to rack my brains as to how many you were. I think it was half, maybe even less that. So keep on doing it. And we'll keep on talking to you for as long as you'll let us.
Oh, well, really appreciate the coverage that you've given. And if anyone feels as if they may be experiencing this, head to longcovid.org, and there's resources on there as well as links to our online support group.
Claire Hasty, founder of the Long COVID Support Group, thank you. I want a final word to Dr. David Strain, Senior Clinical Lecturer from the University of Exeter Medical School, also leads the British Medical Association's response to long COVID. David, we've talked a little bit on the show about how vaccination does seem to be helping long COVID. We've talked a little bit about how we've got some information now on key symptoms and that actually women tend to suffer from long COVID more than men do. What else have we learned recently that is significant, or perhaps what are developments that you think we might see soon?
So we're getting a lot more information about the impact of vaccines. So, for example, just last week, we heard if you get COVID despite being double vaccinated, you're about half the risk of going on to develop COVID. So that tells us something in its own right. It tells us that there is something about how long the virus hangs around in your body that triggers the long COVID. Just this afternoon, I was having a conversation with our counterparts in Switzerland who've noticed a very similar phenomenon, that there seems to be something about the duration of the infectivity that is associated with it, so much so that we're starting a collaboration to find out, is the virus hanging around in immunoprotected cells? So basically in the gut or in the top of your nose, there are places that your immune system can't get to. The immune system is fabulous at clearing it as soon as it's in your blood, but it can't get to everywhere. And it may well be that that's somewhere that virus or other viral particles are hanging out, which is a trigger for this ongoing symptoms that people get.
Yeah.
But as Claire says, COVID itself, long COVID itself, is a multi-system disease, and lots of people are presenting differently. It is very likely we're going to see multiple different causes. And I think something else that Claire's highlighted is there does appear to be family trends here. I mean, Claire and her children have got it. So we just launched a study looking at the genetics of long COVID, and anyone listening who wants to join in that, we've paired up with the group who do 23andMe. So you sign in, you get the genetics pack at home, you get to send that back, and you get the standard report that you get to find out how many of your ancestors were from Vikings, for example. But we are looking to find out what is the genetic link. And we're going to be pairing up with Decode ME, the group that from Action for ME that Sonya is very much involved in, to find out how many genes are the same, how many genes are different, and are we looking at a similar sort of genotype?
Wow.
We've also seen that people are more like, people who have got asthma, people who've got other atopic conditions, and as you say, women are more likely to get this. And this is all in keeping with it being autoimmune. The gold standard that we're looking for, though, is the test. I think as Claire, as Dr. Khan and Sonya have said, the biggest problem all of our patients, for both in my ME clinic and in the long COVID clinic, is that failure of recognition. And, you know, the fact that all of their tests are normal doesn't mean that there's nothing wrong. That just means that we don't yet have the right test for them. Yeah. And as soon as we've got the right test, which is what lots of different groups are working on now, then we'll be able to have a good idea about what the right treatments are going forward, which, of course, is the next stage of research that we're involved in.
Really, really interesting. So the search for a test, genetics also being researched as well. Will you come back and let us know when you've got some news, please, Dr. David Strain? Thanks so much for joining us, and to Monique Jackson as well, who we spoke to a little bit earlier on. Dr. David Strain is Senior Clinical Lecturer at the University of Exeter Medical School. Thanks for joining us. Thanks to all of our panellists.